Hello and welcome to this edition of Gaza in Context, an ongoing teaching series organized by Jadaliyya in consortium with nearly 36 educational centers, programs, and departments globally. My name is Noura Erakat. I'm a co-editor of Jadaliyya and a professor of Africana Studies in Criminal Justice at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. We apologize for the delay in starting. We were about 3 minutes delayed and are happy to be on now. In today's episode, my co-host and moderator, Mouin Rabbani, and I are discussing the swift and sudden collapse of the Syrian regime, which, as put by Professor Bassam Haddad, raises serious questions for which we still do not have answers. In an effort to articulate those questions, name what we already know, place these seismic events into historical context, and speak on the implications that we can name with confidence, Mouin and I are speaking with illustrious experts on Syria. Bassam Haddad is founding director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program and associate professor at the Shar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He is the author of Business Networks in Syria, The Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience, and co-editor of A Critical Political Economy of the Middle East. Bassam is co-founder and editor of Jadaliyya Ezine and the executive director of the Arab Studies Institute. He is currently working on his second Syria book titled Roots, Dynamics, and Transformation of the Syrian Uprising. We are also joined by Omar Dahi, who is a co-editor of Jadaliyya and a professor of economics at Hampshire College and founding director of Security in Context, a research network on peace, conflict, and international affairs. He is published in academic outlets such as the Journal of Development Economics and Applied Economics, Southern Economic Journal, Political Geography, Middle East Report, Forced Migration Review, and Critical Studies on Security. His last book was South-South Trade and Finance in the 21st Century, Rise of the South, or A Second Divergence, co-authored with Firat Demir. Finally, Mouin Rabbani is a researcher, analyst, and a commentator specializing in Palestinian affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East. He has, among other positions, previously served as Principal Political Affairs Officer with the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Head of Middle East with Marty Ahtisari Peace Foundation, and Senior Middle East Analyst and Special Advisor on Israel-Palestine with the International Crisis Group. Mouin is co-editor of Jadaliyya, where he also hosts the Connections podcast and edits its Quick Thoughts feature. Welcome to all of you. I want to start off by asking the first question that sets us in the present. This question is for obviously Omar and Bassam. We're asking you to reflect on the current moment, both personally and politically, in terms of the significance for Syria and the region. We've also heard you both comment publicly that you've had mixed feelings about these recent developments, and we'd love for you to elaborate.
Hi, Noura. Hi, Mouin and Bassam. Thank you so much for hosting us. I know how incredibly busy both of you are, but really glad that we could all take this moment to think about what's happening in Syria and to process it together. This is how I think about today's talk, basically, us trying to follow fast-moving developments and try to make as best sense of them as we can, given our relative knowledge about Syria. Yes, it's become a truism. Actually, all Syrians that I know, that I'm in touch with, talk about mixed emotions that they're feeling right now, actually. But the balance of that mix depends on your positionality, I suppose. If it's unfettered joy, if you're someone who is directly affected by the brutality of the Syrian government, being released from prison, someone who is displaced directly or indirectly as a result of the violence, and lots of other people who had their lives shattered because of this war, and particularly vis-a-vis the Syrian government. There's other people who have different balance of I guess, that joy, but also apprehension as to the fact that Syria is going to an unknown. And I think that's something that we have to understand, that because there was a civil conflict type situation in Syria, people are going to have radically different perspectives on what's happening, just as there were sharply different perspectives during the war. And of course, there was polarization that was created because of the war. And I'm sure we're going to be talking about that. The other aspect of this is the costs, and this is part of my personal mixed emotions. Both the cost of what it took to get us to this moment in terms of the loss of human life, in terms of the depolarization within society, in terms of the various ways in which country was destroyed, both kind of physical infrastructure, but also the displacement and the upheaval, the what I refer to as the loss of national sovereignty as a result of the basic foreign occupation of Syria and foreign influence of multiple regional and international countries, which we'll also talk about. So all of those we need to actually think about as well, because those were part of what led us to the moment as well, and I think they're very troubling. But also where we are in the current moment as well, what's happening regionally with genocide in Palestine, uh, the kind of regional war that we see, or the regional conflict that we see, and the costs that are being paid at all levels. So that's an aspect of it. Another aspect that I wanted to talk about in terms of kind of opening thoughts and feelings is that there are major needs right now for the Syrian population that are on a lot of our minds. Uh, the war has left Syria in bad shape. There's been crippling economic sanctions that have devastated society, have hollowed out the state. There's there was geographic fragmentation. So there are massive needs, and those need to be organized somehow. There's healthcare needs, there's educational needs, all sorts of ways in which we need to actually think about economic production. And I think that's on my mind as someone who studies this, who was involved in various ways in kind of thinking about this over the past 10 years. But we also need to think about the current moment. I think we're at a seismic shift regionally, a radically different and new reality in terms of where we're heading in the entire Middle East, with changed landscape from the past year and a half and from the past decades as well. And I was just chatting with my brothers just earlier today, and other friends over the past few weeks, that we need to organize for the moment, but we also need to think about the next decade, where we want to be in the next decade, and what does it mean to do the political organization, to do the thinking, to do the work that's going to take us where we want to be, because that's the level, I think, of change in this reality now. And lastly, I want to say that over the past decade, I've worked with lots of different initiatives that have brought together people from um, more the government side, whether they're directly affiliated with government institutions or they find their political perspectives um, closer to the government, and also lots of opposition side as well. And when they're talking behind the scenes, when they're actually, off the record, there's a lot of agreement among a lot of those people, despite the fact that there are disagreements. But the fault lines of the conflict that actually took place before need not be the ones that we have moving forward. I think a lot of people on the opposition side have more in common with sectors on the governmental side in terms of core interests, or even kind of their perspectives on how the Syrian state should look like. Whereas on the opposition side, there are all sorts of people who radically disagree. So I think we need to kind of start thinking, taking a step back and thinking, what are the new alliances going to be? What are the new kind of possibilities for organizing? So those are some of the thoughts that I have right now.
Thank you, Omar. Bassam, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I actually am happy that Omar gave a broader view, because I would like to hone in a little bit on what happened, and some of the background to what happened and how people took it. So thanks, Omar, again for this introduction. Thanks to Noura and Mouin for taking the time. I want to start by saying that what I've been saying. So if this is repetitive, I apologize. That it's difficult to underestimate what the collapse of the Syrian regime means to Syrians and to the region. We're still picking up the pieces, as you all know. Every day we hear about things that actually cause us to think and rethink. Not the biggest pictures, but to think and rethink some of the details that we don't know about. Most pressing, actually, before we talk about regional and geopolitical matters, which I would like to address, we should recognize the untold pain many Syrians were doled out during the past 54 years. And not all Syrians, some were privileged, of course. And these people who have suffered this pain are not just the dissidents, just ordinary people who were just paying attention to their own lives, trying not to engage in politics because that's the cardinal sin sometimes if you are not supportive. Myself, as somebody who I'm half Syrian, I'm Lebanese, but I'm half Syrian. I did my dissertation on Syria. I traveled to Syria. Every time I travel into Syria, no matter what I'm thinking politically in my head and geopolitically, if you will, it's nerve-wracking to go through the like literally nerve-wracking. And I've lived through wars, and I've actually sort of, what's the word, I actually went to war zones to document and film and research. But when I go through the border from Lebanon to Syria with my laptop, granted, I'm working on the political economy of Syria, and that's not a pleasant topic for the Syrian regime. It was nerve-wracking, but I would leave and I'm fine. Others go through these things every day, and these are very superficial things. We have seen on television and social media the dungeons that speak a different story, and the dungeons are limited, by the way, to how many people are in them, even if it's in the thousands or even tens of thousands. But the millions have lived a very difficult life, especially if they are dissidents, but also if they have political views. The sense of relief, therefore, is too vast to take in and process in a conversation. But those of us who witnessed it understand it fully. I'd like to say a couple words about how this all happened in the past 2 weeks, notably Saturday and Sunday. And it's remarkable how swift, actually swifter than any analyst on the face of this earth could have conjectured, the Syrian regime withered without much as a peep from the brutal dictator who had no problem dumping barrel bombs on his cities. He just picked up and left with no warning or note or a speech, even to the people who stood by him, who are now literally pissed off. I have connections like you all do. And even those people, my family, for instance, is, split in a way. Those who support his removal from the very beginning, and those who don't necessarily care for him or don't like him at all, but are afraid of the alternative. And even those people became completely convinced that this dictator, leader, to hell with him, given that he actually didn't have a word to say to anyone. So imagine if you're a dissident, imagine if you're tortured by the regime, imagine all these other possibilities. This signaled, in my view, what I have been writing and saying about the Syrian regime for many years, decades, that it is a brittle regime, especially in the face of real danger, and especially when it faces it alone. Bashar inherited, but ended up exacerbating, a Syria that is completely bereft of any other centers of power that have any autonomy, relative or otherwise, that would have a semblance of initiative without his approval. So we know that what happened is actually dictated by the top leadership in terms of the absence of any communication at all levels. During the early weeks of the uprisings, we also saw something we saw something different, I mean to say, actually. And we will come to that later. We'll come to the uprising, hopefully, later. Bashar Asad left Syria unannounced on the 7th of December, 2024. Reportedly, not even his brother knew the details. Maher Asad, his brother, was arguably His and the regime's protector, the last line of defense, and supposedly the shining armor in command of the 4th Division of the Syrian army, intended to secure Damascus and more specifically the presidential palace and the president and so on. Late on Sunday, we heard Bashar is in Moscow with his nuclear family and the closest, wait for it, the closest economic advisors, as reports indicate. Yes, we need to confirm that, but it's not far-fetched. These advisors handle the family's untold wealth because obviously preparations have been made. To call this a regime collapse, in my view, even though we all consensed on titling this event regime collapse, is an overstatement. By contrast, Saddam Hussein's regime collapse in spring 2003 in the face of the advancing barbaric and fraudulent invasion of the United States was apt. The word collapse then was apt because it did collapse. There was some fighting and it collapsed. The Syrian regime actually didn't collapse. It withered. As we say in Arabic, talasha. Bashar just picked up and left, as somebody said. We still do not know the details. When was this decision made to just do that? Was it after he learned neither Iran, Russia, or Hezbollah were willing to fight to keep the regime afloat shortly after November 27th, when Hay'at Tahrir Al-Sham began attacking Aleppo? If so, how fast must he have made arrangements with Russia, maybe? What did he say to the to commanders of coercive apparatuses and to the top political leadership? What did they say in return? These things are really remarkable that either did not happen or we do not know anything about them because we haven't heard anything from anyone. Just one official said that they will actually respect the transfer of power. And that official, the prime minister, actually, the interesting thing is that so many Syrians, including myself, who study Syria for a living, if you will, it was the first time I figured out who's the prime minister recently, given the lack of importance of these people, of people at that in those positions in Syria, given who actually is in charge. And given virtually no peep was announced to the public, was it because he did not initiate such an effort, or also because he shut down such initiatives? These seem to be frivolous details for many people, but not for the people of Syria. In addition to the relief, this is also an issue, especially those who thought, especially also people outside Syria who supported not the regime, but the role that the regime held. This is the dictator that did that they somehow felt they can be in the same camp for the sake of combating imperialism and all these horrible things, which is, in my view, legitimate. But this is the dictator that was on that side. So this is not, I'm not going to say anything right now about coordination between Turkey and other players, because without Turkey, this couldn't have happened to begin with, the HDS advance. And I'll leave that to later. But I just wanted to start with, for me, what is a sobering reality regarding the impact on Syrians and how this happened.
Thank you, Bassam, and Omar and Noura, also great to be with you. So before delving deeper into these developments both of you have referenced, I'd like us to take a step back to understand how we got here. Not only the context of over a decade of conflict within Syria, but also the longer trajectory, in order to get a better understanding of what was, until recently, the Syrian regime. I'd like you to tell us more about the former regime and how to understand it in the context of the Middle East. How should we characterize it? Was it a family dynasty, a one-party state, a sectarian polity, a combination of the above? And more recently, what is the relationship between the neoliberal turn that Bashar took after he assumed power at the beginning of this century, and the uprisings that erupted in the country in 2011.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, and we'll try our best to kind of parse through this. And I think, what I'll try to do is to focus on some aspects of what you raised, Mouin, and maybe there's a back and forth that we can have with Bassam in case I forget something, and we can kind of add back because there are
Yeah,
different
feel
elements there,
free. Yeah.
the back, and then we kind of go to there. I mean, I think a lot of these are given, unfortunately, how the Syrian conflict took over 13 years. A lot of people who knew very little about Syria got a chance to familiarize themselves with the country. And this is part of the strange knowledge production about Syria, which is that, prior to 2010, 2011, there's very, very little known about it. And suddenly after 2011, it became almost overdetermined in some way. But basically, without trying to go too far back, I think it's important to say that this regime, in order to kind of also come back to the present moment that we started with, but this regime comes out of the broad Arab nationalist movements, the movements in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, particularly the kind of radical Arab nationalist movements that were radicalized by the Nakba, first and foremost, among other factors, but first and foremost the Nakba, where they developed a trenchant critique of the existing Arab regimes as well as of global imperialism. And from that, you had different variants of Arab nationalism. The Ba'ath Party, the Nasserist left were two of the main ones that came to rival each other in Syria. And of course, within the Ba'ath Party, there were divisions as well. So from that broad left Arab nationalist kind of moment came the Ba'ath Party, which took power in 1963. Syria in the 1950s was famously a site of struggle for many international powers or regional powers at the very least. And often Syria experts exemplify this by the famous book by Patrick Seal called The Struggle for Syria, where he talks about the different political factions in Syria and their regional backers and what politics they represented, whether Iraq or Egypt or Saudi Arabia, which were the kind of major ones. And there was the briefly formed United Arab Republic under Jamal Abdel Nasser from 1958 to 61. And the Assad party, after the Ba'ath Party came to power and kind of ruled for about 7 years, there were internal kind of shifts of power between what's called the radical left-wing edge of the Ba'ath Party and the more conservative, moderate edge of the Ba'ath Party. Assad represents what was called the more moderate version of the Ba'ath Party, which took power really and was able to rise to power in the aftermath of the defeat of the Arab armies in 1967. The kind of description of the state, it was a state that was created by the Ba'ath Party, really. And that's exemplified, for example, that we were under what was called the 1973 Constitution. So that was the constitution that ruled Syria, or that was governed Syria until the start of the uprising, when there was a modification, a new constitution that was developed. But basically, it was a country characterized by extreme centralization of power. The 1973 Constitution was a constitution of the Ba'ath Party. So in the preamble to the 1973 Constitution, the Ba'ath Party was listed as the leading party in society. It was the only political party mentioned, and it read more like a manifesto of the Ba'ath Party as essentially the leading engine of history that's going to unify the Arab lands. And the Constitution itself gave exceptional de jure powers for the president. So all three branches of government were subjugated or under the president. Essentially, the president headed in various ways all three branches of government. He could legislate by decree. He could annul the National Assembly at will. He was also the head of the judicial system. So there was this extreme de jure centralization of power. And so essentially there was the rule of the party, and state institutions were under the management of the party, and within the party the office and the person of the president themselves was the kind of the key was the key actor basically. And so you had that kind of political system. That doesn't fully capture the kind of political reality in Syria, because in addition to that, there was the de facto powers of the state security agencies, of which there were multiple, and which basically acted with impunity to stifle dissent and political life in the country. So it was a highly restricted country in terms of free speech, in terms of civil liberties, in terms of the ability to organize collectively. And that, with the combination of the fact that most of the loyalties of the state security agencies were then under the president, gave the president incredible power. And this happened under Assad the father, and in many ways continued under Bashar Asad the son, despite the various shifts. Now, a feature of that was a kind of a hybrid, a state socialist economy that also, after Assad came to power, accommodated with various private sector groups, particularly merchant groups in Damascus and Aleppo. There were waves of nationalization of private industry that had taken place under Jamal Abdel Nasser and land redistribution. Some of those, most of those were continued in various ways. But one of the things that you referred to is the neoliberal turn. Basically, in Syria, that essentially meant not neoliberalism perhaps as it was implemented in other places, because Syria never came under the tutelage of the IMF and the World Bank directly, but a gradual retrenchment of the state and opening of the economic sphere for new actors and for the ability of private actors to trade, for example, in terms of imports and exports, in terms of service provision, in terms of a lot of the services that the state used to provide, it withdrew from. And that continued in various ways. As a result of crisis, there was more and more opening. And under Bashar, that accelerated significantly. But what that also meant was that there was a reconfiguration of power of the actors and who kind of the key dominant figures were. And that essentially was something that characterized the decade in the lead up to the uprising, where the predatory nature of many of the new actors that had been empowered by this opening was for all to see. It was unrestricted. It essentially excluded previous economic actors, as Bassam documents in his book. But it also meant a vast retrenchment of the state from the periphery, from the countryside, increasing imbalances within the country, and really deepening all sorts of fault lines which came to bore in the uprising.
Bassam,
Yeah,
your thoughts?
I actually want to thank Omar for laying out the narrative. I would like to sort of jump in and add a few comments about important nodes that help us explain what happened. And I know that even I am really looking forward to getting to the quote unquote, I don't want to say juicy, that's so insensitive, but the stuff of what's happening today that we are witnessing. But I'll start with, there are a couple of things. First, in 1970, when Assad took over, it was a function of a challenge between him and Salah Jadid, who was he was not so much like more. Assad was more pragmatic. Salah Jadid was more dogmatic. All right. I mean, I'm not going to go into the details, but on the spectrum, Salah Jadid, the president at that point, Assad was the defense minister. Interestingly, during the 67 defeat, took over. He was more pragmatic. He felt that Salah Jadid's socialist or semi-socialist reforms were going too far, and they were going to begin to impact and harm middle farmers, that Assad thought the state needs to rely on that sort of level of, or this class or subclass. In all cases, when he took over, the Ba'ath had already transferred the authority of the state or the regime from the party in the 60s to the army. And what Assad did, he's transferred that authority in summary form now, from the army to the security services for the most part, and all actually did function. The party functioned, the bureaucracy functioned, and the army functioned. But the nucleus of power were the dozen plus branches, because they kept expanding security service branches. Now, the other point later on is, yes, the regime after Assad took over established détente with the previous ruling classes, if you will, with the previous liberal social forces, the business community, in order to actually have a strong domestic polity that could serve Assad's regional interests, which were to establish parity with strategic parity with Israel, at least defensively, and second, to be able to literally yank Syria out, or pull Syria out of this predicament that it survived through for decades, where Syria was the prize that all other players would try to possess or control. Now Assad wanted to make Syria the starting point, the launching pad for actually dominating or controlling to some extent, or actually struggling for a Middle East in its own image, at least within the more limited Middle East where he was. Now, moving on to these corrections that he did, he called the movement in 1970-71 the corrective movement, Al-Harakat Tashihiyya. In all cases, why is this important to our conversation? It's important because he was able to build a much broader coalition. This broader coalition survived for a decade and a half, began to falter in the 80s, as Omar said, and there was a beginning of a shift towards, from labor, which was the main ally, to select business actors or select members of the business community or moguls from the business community, which ended up becoming formal in the 1990s. This shift began to have the regime lose its main social base, and the idea that it also comported with what was happening globally in the Soviet Union and beyond, where the Washington consensus economically and socioeconomically began to take over, and the shift from the public sector oriented or public economic sector oriented economies towards a more mixed or even a capitalist economy. This move ended up actually shortchanging and further undermining the original mass base of the regime and the plurality of human beings in Syria. This shift began to polarize Syrian society, and the advent of Bashar continued that shift, accelerated it tremendously after 2002 or 3, when he consolidated his power after 2000, because it wasn't a cakewalk, given some people were irked that a young kid would take over. A kid, as Shihabi said at one point, used to sit on his lap prior. The point is that Bashar ended up exacerbating this movement in a neoliberal direction and polarizing society further. A ton of details can be brought in here, but the point is that this social polarization was the precursor to the uprising. The mass discontent that was created as a result of these economic policies that benefited some and harmed the overwhelming majority of Syrians, even though the cities looked nicer and so on, were the background. And I'm not saying it caused the uprising. The uprising was caused by many other factors that we can talk about maybe in another setting altogether. The point is that what Bashar ended up doing during the uprising in terms of social base, and this is critically important for understanding the introduction that I actually put forth, where no one knew about what he was doing, and he couldn't rely on anybody, not just regional powers. He couldn't rely on people within the state. So he lost, first of all, the mass base of labor, and then focused on a small group that ended up actually siphoning off most of the benefits of the development of the Syrian economy in a neoliberal manner, which caused polarization. I will end with this. During the uprising, Syria, or the Syrian regime, had support from Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia, and was able to actually win over and basically retain rule. After the uprising, in what can be called late conflict, like after the major hostilities ended when Aleppo was recaptured by the regime, 16, 17, 2017, 18 were years of some sort of a stretch towards recapturing the most important part of Syria, minus Idlib and the parts that Turkey controlled in the north, and of course the Americans and the Kurds to the northeast. What I'm trying to get at is between 2020 and 2024, as a result of COVID, health pandemics, as a result of the crippling sanctions that, of course, the United States imposes on countries and ends up harming the people far more than the dictators. And as a result of the not inability, the lack of willingness of the leadership to expend the resources that it did own, which it does own until today, no one knows where they are, to at least try to build itself from even a selfish perspective, try to build its army, try to provide goods and services even to the protectors of the regime. It didn't do that. So it ended up losing the military connection. The people on the ground didn't actually have the subsistence or the means to achieve just subsistence in so many ways. The regime in 2024 was left alone inside Syria, not just outside Syria. And people who had stood by the regime, even before he left without a word, were beginning to say, what did we get out of supporting the regime against, quote unquote, the jihadists and the terrorists and the imperialists and so on? So there is a context prior to the departure of Assad. I mean, it's actually a departure. There wasn't even a meeting that actually tried to retain or preserve the regime while Assad departed, like in Tunisia or Egypt. He just left. And he left for a good reason, because there was nothing to stay for. And it's not just Iran and Hezbollah and Russia being busy, weakened, or timid. It was also his own defense forces that weren't ready to fight. So I wanted to say that. The only thing I want to add is that, yes, it was a regime that can be called patrimonial. I don't like that term because of the burden, because of the baggage it carries as well, Orientalist baggage when talking about other parts of the world and authoritarian regimes. But it's important to note that the Syrian regime, as much as it was dominated by Alawi figures ultimately, it wasn't a Alawi regime period that produced Alawi policies in society. It was Alawi in constitution, but in policies, it was actually repressive throughout. The policies were the policies of many similar dictatorships in late developing countries, for the most part, of course, with exceptions at the individual and small group level for people that are connected with the regime. And of course, most of them were Alawi, and some of them were Sunni actually, or Christian, or Ismaili, or Druze, or what have you. But this idea that it was a Alawi regime that produced Alawi policies is something that doesn't comport with the overwhelming majority of the state in which Syrians lived across Syria, whether they are Sunni, Alawi, Christian, or otherwise. So I'll stop here, and I hope we can get to the moment, because I think we are.
No, can I jump in quickly,
Please
Mouin?
do.
Is that okay? Well, first of all, Bassam, you cheated because you did jump to the current moment, but we said we're going to wait, but it's okay. I'll let it go. In the spirit of forgiveness. I think this point about, because I said prior to 2010, perhaps Syria was unknown, and then after 2010 became overdetermined. And by that, I don't know if overdetermined is the right word, but I mean, in a sense that a lot of people thought they knew everything about it and could explain everything that's happening through a single lens. And one of the most baffling and difficult ones is this sectarian question. I mean, I myself was born and raised in the country and grappled with this on a daily, not grappled with it in terms of thought about it, but it's something you kind of confront consciously or unconsciously all the time. And I still didn't know how to characterize it, as with many others. And I think, I mean, the basic idea is that the regime itself came from and developed an alliance and a method of rule that privileged Alawis and particularly kind of close relatives within the Alawi sect to kind of positions of power. And I think there's an important historical analysis of this, like in Hanna Batatu's famous book, if people have read it, which basically talks about the dialectic of opposition to Assad and him reverting to more sectarianism in result of, or as in response to, the oppositional groups increasingly taking on sectarian kind of undertones. So, there's an aspect, an undertone of that is that when the Ba'ath Party came to power and when Assad came to power, there was, let's say, a canceled elite in Syria that essentially either fled the country or became prohibited, and some of them re-emerged in the uprising from outside of Syria. I mean, I think it's important to kind of think about that. But although a lot of those were prohibited from any political life in Syria, along many others, but even existence as kind of as such. And so, I think the way Bassam and others have put this, and I've put it, is that sectarianism in Syria was a means to an end rather than an end to itself. The goal was not to produce an Alawi supremacist, privileged group. And in fact, we know that that's not the case. We know that there was deep poverty among that. But that's what gives this issue of minoritarian rule and how do we think about that kind of aspect of it, greater pause. And I think that
Can I just say that at the point of contact between individual and power, it looked that way, because I know that a lot of people will go crazy about this comment. It did look like this at the point of contact between regime and power. I'm sorry, Mouin. I mean, Omar, sorry.
No, it did look that way. And I think this is where the difficulty of kind of explaining this is that for many people, it did look that way, and they could point to various instances like privileges in the army, like the ability to escape various kind of punishments, that there's uneven kind of application of the law in various ways. But in Syria, regardless or in addition to all of this, it was impossible to talk about any of these things. You could not, unlike, for example, in Lebanon, where people speak as a Sunni or as a member of this sect or as a member of that sect, that was completely forbidden. So management and even discussion about this reality was completely suppressed until the uprising, when it kind of came out or exploded in probably the worst possible ways, although that was also accompanied by positive initiatives and attempts to grapple with it. But there was no attempt to think about these divisions within society, and then they were being entrenched because they were all papered over, and you could go to jail for speaking about them. It was called Itharat al-Na'arat al-Taifiyya, where basically you're trying to evoke and splinter the country by invoking sectarian difference.
Thank you to you both. That was quite comprehensive in thinking about the historical depth and the context that basically there's a consolidation of power and the state for the sake of, so-called stability, radical change marked by the ascendance of Bashar and an opening of the Syrian economy that exacerbates what had already been, a pressure box or a tinderbox, so to speak, that as you're describing to us, erupts in what we see as the Syrian uprising in 2011. So then we wanted to bring this up to the present, as you said, Bassam, in thinking about the juicy details. You've covered so much of that for us, but maybe we can just hone in for a moment on, the various ways that you've described, either it being the withering of the state, what folks in the comment section are saying, it was a handover, it was an earthquake. This was ultimately a change of circumstance between that stalemate in 2018, 2019 to this, to the present moment that accelerated and culminates in a matter of days in what you can describe as a bloodless coup, and one that is precise. It's precisely this that's raising all these questions, that there was originally fighting in Homs and Aleppo, but then not a single shot fired in Damascus. And we're gleaning from all of these various details, what is happening? What explains this? What are the negotiations that might have happened behind the scenes that leads us? So if you leads us to this present moment, I know that so much of it is unanswered, but what do we know? And what can we help, at least what questions can we raise in this moment that we should be looking out for to help piece the rest of the story together?
Do you want me to start, Bassam?
Yes, you're.
Okay. So, like you said, Noura, the closer we get to the moment, the less we're certain about this. But I think it's important to kind of quickly recap that over the past 13 years, this uprising went through several phases in terms of territorial control and what powers were on kind of which territory and what was happening kind of politically between them. But basically, there was initially a kind of fragmentation of the country because there was the uprising itself, and I'm talking about the period after the uprising kind of changed into an all-out armed conflict between the government and its opponents. And initially, there was a massive injection of cash and weapons from the Gulf, from Turkey, that had created, and of course, there was kind of Al Qaeda coming from Iraq, that had created a massive fragmentation of hundreds and thousands of militias that were fighting all over the place. And the government was overwhelmed, the regime forces were overwhelmed. And that period actually was a major catalyst of the mass displacement because it was all over the place and the front lines weren't even that clear. And that gradually then evolved, without again going into a blow by blow account of the uprising, that evolved into consolidation of this kind of fragmentation into areas of control, where the Syrian government was in charge of most of the central areas, Damascus, up to the Euphrates River. In kind of east of the Euphrates, there were, and the northeast, there were Kurdish political forces with U.S. support that came in the aftermath of the attack on ISIS in 2014. And in the northwest of Syria was divided into basically two basic zones, one that was under directly Turkish control and one that was led by, eventually, the Hay'at Tahrir Al-Sham, HTS, consolidated its power after kind of defeating all other powers there or absorbing them. So that's basically the front lines that were shattered in this last attack by HTS, which took place, starting, I think, November 26th, 27th, I believe. And that was governed by a process that was convened by Russia and Turkey and Iran called the Astana process, that had essentially frozen the conflict, that did not create any political settlement, but essentially it was part of and reflective of that. No side felt that they could win, but no side could agree on what a comprehensive settlement could look like. So it was part of the conflict management by regional international powers. So there was tacit agreement between the US and Russia, as well as Turkey and Iran, that these are the front lines. So in a way, the surprise was that those front lines were supposedly frozen because of an agreement under the Astana process. So that's one aspect of the surprise, because the government and maybe Iran would not have expected those lines to be breached. The other aspect of this is that we've had significant ways in which the economic sanctions and the war itself has devastated Syria's economy and sapped the morale of the society, and I can imagine the army itself, because the economic situation in Syria was vastly deteriorating. Lots of people who had even stuck through the most violent aspects of the war were beginning to leave Syria because of the economic situation had become unbearable. And this was as a result of the destruction from the war, as a result of the sanctions, and the financial crisis in Lebanon in the aftermath of 2019, which Lebanon was one of the few outlets where Syrians could actually kind of trade and get kind of external kind of supplies inside the country because of the tightening of the sanctions. So all of that combined to severe economic deterioration, and I think for lots of people, there was no change in sight. And I think this is what's very frustrating to me, and as I watch this collapse, is that the during this whole time, the government had won. The Syrian regime had won. They essentially won the war. They defeated most of the threat to it. But there was really no attempt at political reconciliation. There was no attempt at reviving a political process seriously. There was a complete rejectionism, even of a very muted constitutional rewrite process that was sponsored by the United Nations, and no attempt as well at settling with the de facto powers that were in the country, namely Turkey. And it's come out, and we know, and that in the past several months, there were gestures by Turkey, even a invitation by the president of Turkey for the Syrian president to come to talks without preconditions, and that they were rejected by the Syrian president because the Syrian president essentially wanted Turkey to completely withdraw from Syria. I'm not sure, that's what we're told, but whatever the demands from the Syrian president were, they rejected these overtures. Syria's allies, Russia and Iran, are claiming now that they've advised constantly the president to reconcile with their opponents. I believe that because managing Syria is becoming a huge burden on both of them. And therefore, it's really some solution that accommodated even minimally the opposition, that would provide for some kind of maybe legitimate government. By legitimate, I mean the majority of Syrians would see it as legitimate, and also it might get international recognition, would have been a way out of this, but that didn't happen. And I think what the interpretation that we have is that the HTS, partly prompted by Turkey, the degree of that we don't know yet, but at the very least, with its full knowledge and tacit coordination, decided to improve its bargaining power, in my opinion, to create facts on the ground before Donald Trump became president, in that interim period, to force facts on the ground so that they would have even greater leverage and bargaining power if and when Trump decided, for example, to remove U.S. troops from Syria. And their offensive to increase their bargaining power was much more successful than they anticipated, and they essentially, the regime was overwhelmed, the regime's army, and they melted away to reposition, but then they get overwhelmed again. By the time I think they got to Damascus, there was an agreement. So this was not something that just happened in the same way in Aleppo. So in Aleppo, I think they were truly surprised and overwhelmed. By the time they came in Damascus, the troops could probably have fought. So those are the most loyalist guards. But I would say, thankfully, there was, by that time, an agreement to spare the bloodshed, both because that would have been absolutely devastating, and also because the way it happened provided an opening now, because it was as bloodless as possible, to actually transition a little bit more seamlessly and preserve government institutions. But lastly, I would say that it's obvious, I think, that the destruction or the severe degradation of the resistance axis by Israel and the US over the past year and a half is the key factor of this, because that is what greatly weakened the allies of the government, such that this would have been possible. And I think both Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah were obviously occupied elsewhere and kind of not in a position, whether they wanted to or not, I think, by the time the offensive collapsed, to meaningfully respond.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on that with you, Bassam. Both of you have explained why the Syrian leadership had so few allies left by the end of last month, and why it found so few Syrians willing to continue fighting on its behalf. But I think there's more to say about the role of its foreign allies. Regardless of Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine, Syria was its main point of influence in the Middle East and its only warm water port. Similarly, Syria was in many respects the geographical linchpin of the axis of resistance, and was an absolutely vital strategic hinterland for Hezbollah. Yet none of these made a concerted effort to try to save the Syrian regime from collapse. Are the factors that Omar mentioned really the full explanation, or is there more to get an understanding of why they appear to have taken a decision not to intervene forcefully on the government's behalf? And while we're uh, talking about that, you've also mentioned, Bassam, in your introductory remarks, that none of this could have happened without Turkey. Perhaps you could also elaborate a bit on that.
Yes, absolutely. What Omar began to talk about, the exhaustion of the allies is of the regime, is the best starting point. But I think there are things that we need to know. Some of those things we have evidence for, others we do not. We can just infer from unconfirmed reports and from being able to corroborate things in a secondary way, not in a primary source way. So obviously, Iran was, for the first time in many, many years, quite timid about supporting the Syrian regime. And that reason is split. On the one hand, the Iranian regime does not want to re-spark something with Israel, where at this point, given what just happened in terms of the HTS advance, which looked promising, quote unquote, and Israel was ecstatic. Like Israelis, if you've been looking at Israeli television, like don't know what to do with themselves in the past 2 weeks. So the Iranian regime was very careful about this matter. It is still reserving the right to respond to Israel's last strikes. It hasn't responded for a couple of months now, and is not willing to jeopardize, in my view, having its other facilities bombed, because the US had asked Israel not to go beyond the basics. In other words, not to go to the oil fields or to the nuclear capacity, because Iran then could actually do what it can with all sorts of other oil fields that are owned or that are run by the allies of the United States, or even United States bases in the region, and so on and so forth, and could close, some of the passageways for ships and so on, in the Persian Gulf and so on. So Iran was careful in that manner, and so that is important. The other part is that Iran, and a lot of people, can be speculative about this, but Iran has been frustrated by the Syrian regime precisely because of what I had shared, because we know that this is a fact, that there's frustration. We just don't know how deep it runs. Because of what I have shared about the conduct and the allocation of resources or non-allocation of resources by Syria, especially in the past 4 years, and is frustrated by the Syrian refusal and recalcitrance in the face of requests and urging by Iran to establish some sort of détente. And those also came from Turkey, which we understand. In a minute, I'll share more about the frustration of Erdogan with the lack of response of Bashar. Not that Erdogan is at this point the icon of principle. In all cases, because of these two reasons, Iran was not willing to expend resources in terms of material resources and human resources into something that it doesn't feel is able to take care of itself, as opposed to 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, where the image was very different in terms of the Syrian regime's capabilities, readiness, and health, even economic and socioeconomic. Hezbollah, on the other hand, has been degraded in terms of its communications, in terms of its commanders, but it is reconstituting. A lot of people are writing off Hezbollah because they don't know. I don't have any other explanation. Hezbollah is reconstituting. Is it weakened? Absolutely. And who told us that it's severely weakened, or it's weakened considerably? Hassan Nasrallah, before he was assassinated. This is not a secret. But is it collapsed? Is it unable to act? Absolutely not, which is one of the reasons there was interest in, at this point, in a ceasefire, because it needs to retain, or wanted to retain, its capacity for another day. Certainly it was unable to stretch itself further to actually do what it did in spring 2013 and send soldiers and commanders and battalions to Syria. So the other part of the Hezbollah story is that there is also frustration within Hezbollah regarding the Syrian regime. And the frustration is not just of today. It also stretches back to the uprising, where those of us who have been watching closely, there was a frustration then with the Syrian regime's response to the uprising, because whatever the Syrian regime does, it will involve necessarily Iran and Hezbollah because of their organic connection to Syria. And that organic connection is based on some sort of existential link between them, because in the absence of the Syrian regime, we have what we have now, where Israel can just run amok and has destroyed every single serious army base and military capacity of Syria undeterred. And as we say in Arabic, الخير لقدام, what is to come is even worse in terms of the structural potential of domination by Israel, the United States, and their friends in the region. So both of these allies couldn't actually make that decision. Assad knew about it. I do not think he knew about it prior to the advance, although he had signals, but he knew about it once these fighters entered, the HTS fighters entered Aleppo. Everything else, I cannot presume to know about. We don't know what happened. We don't know when things happen, as I shared early on. In terms of Turkey, very quickly, Turkey is the party that gives a green light or a red light to HTS in Idlib. Turkey is in control to a large extent. You could imagine HTS breaking out of Turkey's domination or hegemony, but Turkey actually is said to have delayed the operation from mid-October until today for various reasons. In my view, Turkey and the United States are in conversation, although a lot of people say no. But Turkey and Iran are also in conversation, which is why both urged Bashar to act, to establish some sort of connection, some sort of détente, some sort of formula nationally in Syria.
And Turkey and Russia as well.
Sorry? And absolutely, Turkey and Russia, because Russia knew that its appetite right now is quite limited is quite limited. So the question about Turkey is, and the question we need to ask ourselves, because there are no answers today, what is the complex of trade-offs successively that took place for this result to have transpired? Turkey and the United States and the ceasefire in Lebanon could be an issue where in response, Turkey would actually open the doors for HTS, and Israel is involved as a silent partner. Russia and the Iranians and Turkey could be involved, whereby Russia knows that it will be able to take in Assad, which is why Assad wasn't, quote unquote, saying very much. He knew that there was a plan once Aleppo began to, once these folks walked into Aleppo, once the HTS fighters just marched into Aleppo. In all cases, this string of trade-offs is something we don't know about. Some people email me or call me or send us messages or publish articles, assuming that they know. I don't know how they know. I don't know. And I'm following like literally everything in Arabic, English, and Hebrew via translation. So that's how this happened, and that's what we know today. I am confident we will learn more later. And if we don't learn exactly about the coordination that took place that led to what is happening, we will know by inference through looking at what Israel's going to do next, who Turkey will engage in agreements with next, what Iran's likely to do next vis-a-vis Israel, and what happens in Gaza next, because there is some sort of a, I mean, I'm very hopeful. Maybe that's what's, because, my heart aches every moment as a function of this genocide in Gaza. It could very well be something that will end up actually leading to a swift winding down in Gaza, even before Trump has asked Israel to wrap it up as if it's a sandwich in Gaza. So that explains what we know from my perspective.
Can I just add a few more thoughts to that, if you don't mind? I think throughout the war, even when Iran and Hezbollah came to the military assistance of the government, the Syrian army was the leading force fighting the battles that was enabled the government to recapture territory. I think it's true. I don't know actually if it's true, but it's very, very plausible what a lot of people say, that the regime could have collapsed without Russian and Hezbollah intervention. We don't know that counterfactual, but it's possible. That collapse could have gone in all sorts of different ways, not in the way we see now, but it could have been devolved into the whole country devolving into militias fighting each other. So that counterfactual is hard, as with other things that happen in the war. What would have happened if things had been differently? But nevertheless, it's also a fact that the Syrian army was the leading force in terms of manpower, in terms of ability to actually recapture and hold a lot of these territories. And without the willpower of the Syrian army to fight, I think there's nothing Russia and Hezbollah could have done by the time the offensive happened. That's my own interpretation of things, not based on any information. So whether Hezbollah and Russia and Iran abandoned the regime, or whether they saw, there's a lot of discussions now about, they actually wanted to let it go anyway. It's not necessarily, it wouldn't matter. The only other alternative was a mass carpet bombing campaign that would have destroyed Aleppo and would have destroyed Hamas. So thankfully they didn't try, because that's actually what it took after that collapse. So that's just one point I wanted to make that was on my mind. The other point is that these are not the only actors. So the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, I don't think are going to let Turkey and maybe Qatar be the powers in Syria that influence Syrian politics. Of course, we have Israel that invaded further Syrian territory, but I think that is going to be a major fault line of political divisions within the country. And I think, I'm not optimistic about how this will be resolved. It's often resolved at the expense of Syrians, but I think even among the last 10 years, both in terms of opposition and loyalist groups, there's been a lot of ties with those different parties. So how that's going to be reflected in politics in Syria is something we need to see as well.
I want to jump in here just to say there's a lot that's already been brought up and kind of foreshadows where we wanted to go with this conversation in terms of the potential for regional reconfiguration that, that starts in Syria, but also affects the rest of the region. I also want to highlight that so much of our conversation is abstracting the Syrian people themselves as we're having this conversation. And I think that that's what the moment is allowing us to do. And so there's this tension that's we're pulling on, which is wanting to center the agency of Syrian people, the response in this moment, and also provide some sort of explanation. For me, I wonder what is a bridge that, that bridges kind of that popular sovereignty together with these shifts on the one hand. On the other, I want to add to this, is to think about the future of Syria itself as the leadership of Hay'at Tahrir Al-Sham might bode for the region. So you say earlier, Omar, for example, that under the Assad regime, sectarianism was means but not an end. What do you think that the same can be said about HTS or even close? What is, for example, what do we know from their governance in Idlib that can tell us about pluralism? How do we take seriously what Jalani is saying about dissolving HTS as a possibility? So what do we know about HTS already that can tell us about what that might mean for Syria in the future? And then also if there's any way that we can also bridge so much of the work and the sacrifice of Syrians themselves decades on, and especially in recent years, that helps to also explain these seismic regional shifts.
Bassam, why don't you start and I'll jump in as well.
Well, I've been looking at my notes regarding Hay'at Tahrir Al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra, which is its predecessor, right? And in terms of your question about the sectarianism issue, the Assad regime, the Ba'athist regime, actually emerged from a secular, socialist, Arab nationalist starting point, which is not to be taken lightly. At the same time, the departure from so many of those principles is also not to be taken lightly. In fact, the departure is much more powerful than the starting points. So the sectarianism of the actually practical sectarianism of the regime that is felt by individual Syrians is real. The structural sectarianism in terms of policies is actually very limited. In most cases, most Syrians, I mean, I lived in Syria. I have family in Syria. Syrians who are actually minorities, or Alawis, were also harmed over the decades. So it's a bit complex. Without which, I don't think Syria could have actually, or the regime could have ruled for 54 years. This particular regime, after the Ba'ath took over in 1963. So there are 7 years of Ba'athist rule prior to the Assad Ba'athist rule, which is actually a transformation of the Ba'ath itself. And then, of course, after 2003, and then after the Regional Command Conference in 2005, the entire, socialist terminology and concept and term was dropped from the language of the regime, or even from like official documents. So, on the other side, while I keep hearing everybody is so excited about talking about HTS being jihadists, and I'd never like to use this word, but anyway, people know what jihadists mean. I call these groups that actually have a particular viewpoint of, the goal of what kind of state they want, which is like an Islamic State early on under Jabhat al-Nusra, and how they actually have a particular view that marginalizes other Muslims who are even conservative about their views on Islam. They're not like secular Muslims or atheist Muslims, and they still marginalize them because they don't have the same interpretation of Islam. I call them takfiris or totalitarians or totalitarian Islamists. In all cases, it's important to know that for all the talk about Hay'at Tahrir Al-Sham, it had transformed at various junctures, a couple of times actually. On the one hand, they refused to come under the rubric of ISIS, under Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And then at one point in 2016 and 2017, Jabhat al-Nusra began moving away from the concept of having a singular goal of establishing an Islamic State. Now, of course, this could be rhetoric or it could be real. I don't think it's just rhetoric, because they were telling this to even their followers. And by the way, the people who know Syria and who know the soldiers within Syria, they wanted to fight the regime. And by 2014-15, if you wanted to fight the regime, those who still believe that this is a revolution that is still connected with the original sentiments that produced it, had very few options, and these options were hardline groups, mostly totalitarian groups, on the ground. That is, we're talking about fighters. So there is a change, and then after that, as we have seen in the past 4 or 5 or 6 years, depending on what you are looking at, their governance and everything about the Hay'at Tahrir Al-Sham demonstrate that they are not the same group that emerged in the teens, 2013, 14, 15. Now, what does this mean on the ground? I'm not sure, but I can tell you this for a fact. Well, not for a fact, for certainly in terms of my views, Hay'at Tahrir Al-Sham in its current capacity, whether it has made transformations or not, and even the transformations, they're not my cup of tea personally, and they're not the cup of tea of many Syrians, but there has been a move from a very rigid stance. In all cases, Hay'at Tahrir Al-Sham will not rule Syria. The head of Hay'at Tahrir Al-Sham, Al-Julani, will not rule Syria. I am happy to assert this because it is evident why this is not going to be the case. And it's not just about what Syrians themselves want, because many Syrians would want some sort of a direction that is along those lines, but they're not necessarily, their dream to replace Bashar did not involve Al-Julani or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, ultimately, for many Syrians, let's say. But externally, in terms of the trade-offs or the string of trade-offs that I shared, that is actually responsible in good measure for what has happened, which includes Turkey, but other countries as well, including Iran and the United States. I wouldn't put Russia in there. Those countries, especially Turkey and the United States and their conservative Arab allies, if you look at the Al Jazeera, you get a lot of signals as to what's going on, because their coverage of Syria is very different than their coverage of Palestine. In all cases, all these groups are not going to be content with anything other than some sort of a coalition that will probably definitely include elements from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but will not be confined to it. And the reason is that this is how they actually can create a relatively compliant government in Syria. This is how, for the Arab conservative states, this is how Turkey can rely on having some sort of, or the absence of, threats that it would see from Syria. And we haven't talked about the Kurds yet. We can. And that's how the United States and Israel, because they're very close in some ways, not so close in others, by the way, in terms of what they want. That's how they know that even though Israel has destroyed Syria's military capability in a campaign that is unprecedented in the history of Israel and in the history of its confrontation with Arab states, they don't want any sort of potential of serious collective action to take place inside Syria vis-a-vis Israel or the interests of the United States and Israel in the region. And you can guarantee that by making collective action less probable. And nothing makes collective action less probable than a heterogeneous coalition. I'll stop here
Thank you,
because I think
Bassam.
Omar can fill in the
Well,
blanks or share
if
more.
I can interrupt, because the clock is ticking, and I would like to pose the final question
بس
to
ما بدك معين
Omar.
ما بدك عمر to address this? It's up to you guys.
Yes, don't worry.
All right, no, we're getting to that. So Omar, you had mentioned first Patrick Seal's landmark book, "The Struggle for Syria," and the competition between regional and international powers for influence in Syria, and then Hafez al-Assad's project to transform Syria from a plaything in the hands of regional powers to a regional power itself that exerts influence beyond its borders. And now we've had what Bassam just correctly described as the largest military operation Israel has ever conducted, the purpose of which formally was to wipe out Syria's military capabilities. But I think it's fair to say also with the broader ambition to ensure that there can be no powerful centralized state in Syria. And I think its underlying purpose is to promote the further fragmentation of Syria. So when you take these things together, many people have been warning that Syria could turn into another Libya, but perhaps a more appropriate comparison is that what we really should fear is Syria turning into another Lebanon, looking back at Lebanon during the 1970s and 1980s. So I'd like to get your thoughts looking both at Israel's agenda in Syria, and in addition to that, these other international agendas or regional and international agendas for Syria, and where you think how do you think that defines the present moment and how it will influence matters moving forward, particularly if additional powers, regional or international, also conclude that a fragmented Syria at war with itself best serves their interests in the country.
Yeah, that's a lot. And, I mean, the transformation of Syria from this power to where it was today happened under Bashar al-Assad. I mean, when Bashar took, Hafiz al-Assad died in June 2000, if I remember correctly, and Bashar was officially kind of, assumed power within a few months. Syria was in kind of occupation for some people, in control, a kind of a power broker in Lebanon, and it projected its power outward. And I think we can count actually on all the mistakes that the president made. I mean, I think it's important to make this clear that there was a severe mismanagement. I asked a lot of people who kind of knew Hafiz al-Assad a lot better than I did. How would Hafiz al-Assad had responded to the uprising in 2010 and 2011, assuming they'd say he would have been more brutal. But their response was surprising, that actually no, that he would have found a way to accommodate with the opposition, would have read the international balance of power and realized that the previous situation was unsustainable. And I think that's important to kind of emphasize that Bashar had several opportunities, and we mentioned that throughout those past 25 years, particularly in the uprising, there was an opportunity 2010, 2011 when the uprising started. There was an opportunity after the freezing of the conflict. There was an opportunity after the earthquake of last year, which was a moment we didn't get a chance to talk about it. We could kind of talk more, but that was an opening where actually a political reconciliation would have happened. But at the same time, the countries that have been destroyed over the past decades are the countries outside the military security orbit of the United States: Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and of course the destruction of Palestine. Palestine now. Is that because all the other countries have better governance? No, it's because this is how kind of Western hegemony works. It works through the destruction of its enemies. And now, empowered by Israel, there's a moment of Israeli impunity regionally and globally. And the collapse of the Syrian regime was a symptom of that. So even though Bassam is right, and I don't know much about how much and how well Hezbollah is reconstituted, but there was a severe blow and a severe defeat to the resistance axis, of which this is an outcome. The collapse of the Syrian government is not the cause of suddenly Israel being empowered. It's an outcome of this. And Syria destroyed it because of all the reasons you mentioned, and because it can. It saw an opportunity to do so, and it can. So whether it's for all of those reasons, or it's because it knows it's going to get away with it. So this is a moment of Israeli impunity and hegemony, perhaps. That this is why I kind of mentioned in the beginning, we have to grapple with what is the 10-year plan, perhaps, that we have. Not to be kind of grandiose about it, but to think about where we are right now is a very, very different moment. And I think, we touched a little bit on what the international agenda is, but it's to keep Syria weak, for sure. At best, I agree with you. Actually, I was thinking Lebanon in the 1990s, but it also could be Lebanon in the 1970s, in the lead up to the civil war. But at best, it's Lebanon in the sense of a highly decentralized, but not in a good way, a very weak, non-developmental state, corrupt kind of fiefdoms, and so on. Not to kind of summarize the situation in Lebanon as that, but I think the image that you're trying to evoke. That's at the same time, notwithstanding the fact that there may be different agendas. I don't particularly think Turkey has an interest in the territorial division of Syria. Israel may have that interest. I don't think the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, even though they may be opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood, presence and kind of the empowerment of the Turkish-Qatari axis are necessarily interested in the political division or the territorial fragmentation of Syria. So there's contradictions between the balance of power, and it's not clear yet. I really don't know how to capture or kind of to give you a proper response to that. But I want to also answer Noura's question, because I started off with the question of Syrian people and agency, and the question of where is Syrian society at. And I think part of what I was alluding to is the fact that there have been lots and lots of people who have been trying to kind of think about what this moment means in terms of the political visions. And there's been a weird way in which all of those have been outside of the country, because civil society was stifled inside the country. So there are established and very credible kind of centers of power or influential organizations or activists or people who carry forward to them a vision of Syria that is diametrically opposed to Hay'at Tahrir Al-Sham, because they see it as highly exclusionary. And I agree with Bassam that they have evolved, but their governance in Idlib was abysmal. I mean, they were highly exclusionary. There was also a severe undermining of rule of law. There was a kind of uniformity that was imposed. It is not the kind of vision that most Syrians, at least now, would accept. And that's why we're seeing that, at least this is the hopeful sign, that they approached this very differently, that they wanted to preserve state institutions and reform them from their perspective, that they wanted to build on the kind of established kind of structures that were there. And that's something that we have to support. And I think this is a very dangerous moment right now, because we're seeing a lot of, it's a fast moving situation. A lot of people have sent me, for example, videos of things happening in Syria, that when I contact people in those regions say that these are not true. They're videos that are preemptively showing oppression of minorities, minority groups, and so on. And I can't say that they're completely false. I can't say that every video out there is false, but this is period of uncertainty right now. And I think what we do need is the platforms where the plurality, I'm talking about from a political perspective, not from a kind of minoritarian sect perspective, but a platform where those voices that actually have a kind of a more positive project, more progressive project, can be empowered. There was a lot of women's organizations that mobilized within and kind of with contacts within Syria, but also outside of Syria. So there's a diversity of Syrian civil society that was marginalized that could actually play a role. There's a chance for a political life that was not there before. And again, I say that without trying to be naive or a kind of like there's going to be a marketplace of ideas type of liberal kind of analysis of the situation. But history doesn't stop, and we have to kind of think about what are the opportunities to seize upon and how we can support them in the time being. Because, like I said at the beginning, the needs are immense, and there's so many fault lines of conflict that could reemerge, and I think we really need to take it step by step in terms of tackling those, and then thinking about what's the regional geopolitical picture, because that's unlikely to be things that most Syrians could change. Doesn't mean they shouldn't take a position on it. It's and a lot of Syrians have pointed out the new government should absolutely, even if they can't do anything against Israeli aggression, they need to take a firm position of what they think about it, right? And their positions are essentially seemingly super accommodating, completely accommodating to kind of Western kind of US Israeli demands at this point. But they also, I think, will need to also respond to Syrian society.
If I may, let me see. If I may say something about the Israel point, and then I'll say something about because I know that we're over time, about the question of what's happening in Syria and the future in terms of whether it's popular sovereignty and what's actually happened, what's actually likely to happen or might happen to Syrians, what are things that we can look forward to? On the one hand, in terms of the question of Israel and the region, I mean, this is precisely why there's a huge rift and conflict between so many people watching what's happening in Syria, right? And I'm not convinced by or don't see why there's a huge question, because most Syrians are happy that dictatorship is behind them, or that dictatorship is behind them. But also most Syrians are not unaware of the importance of the question of domination by Israel, the United States, and what is going to be called the importance of resisting that. And we could simply be both against dictatorship and against imperialism. There shouldn't be a huge conflict. The conflict becomes when certain moments compel us to have a position that prioritizes one or the other. And it's also not rocket science, even though it's very complex. But it's not rocket science to figure out when this is the case. Many Iranians, in the face of US discussions to bomb Iran, or many Syrians in the face of discussions to bomb Syria in 2005, although they hated their dictatorship, those same people at least, they were against that. But when it comes to other moments like an uprising, an external intervention, yes, it becomes dicey. What we are seeing today, in order not to rehash the entire conversation, what we are seeing today is the counterfactual that a lot of people who focused, in my view, sometimes excessively on what's happening outside Syria in terms of the question of imperialism and Israel's expansionist approach on the ground. I mean, somebody said the other day, Syria has not actually has returned all land like the Sinai and so on, and they forgot about the Julan and many parts which are now actually expanding. The point is that this counterfactual today tells us what is it that people were concerned about. This enormous destruction of every single military base, the naval fleet, jet fighters, military airports, intelligence operations, research and development centers. Of course, they say they were about chemical weapons, but there's so much more than chemical weapons in research and development centers, and so on and so forth. And this happening without anyone on earth lifting a finger is what everyone has been talking about, even if sometimes people overstated the importance of imperialism and made Syrians invisible in this long passage I wrote, which is based on many articles I've been writing for the past 12 years, 13 years, that yes, sometimes we focus so much on imperialism and make Syrians invisible. And at the same time, when we are looking at dictatorship and wanting it to be removed, and this is, in my view, for Syrians, a priority, it doesn't mean that we cannot be aware of what's likely to happen next, which is what we are observing right now. And I dare say, and I want to say, it's going to get much worse because there's no resistance right now as a result of the state of these groups, countries that have actually played that role. It's going to be a very somber near future. So yes, Israel has had its day and it's celebrating, like I said earlier, like it's 19, whatever that song is. And it's real. And it's really sad because the same people and country that are celebrating are overwhelmingly supporting one of the most horrendous genocides in modern history, in the way it's happening and in the way it's being filmed and in the fact that it's happening now in 2024. Not in the 19th century, in 2024. This is the latest moment of human development, and this is happening and captured on tape, not only by us and others, by the perpetrators themselves who are flaunting the destruction and decimation of human beings. Yeah, so it is confusing. On the other, it is an issue to think about in terms of the tension between what to oppose both, and know when to oppose each, and it does require a bit more digging. But I don't blame Syrians for prioritizing the immediate threat, the immediate oppression that has caused them so much pain for many decades. And speaking of that, what I'm thinking about right now is what kind of development will Syrians have to look for in the
And
absence of.
that's
But just
something that
yeah,
we will have to discuss.
okay. But let me just say one thing: that the people that are now benefiting from this situation, and the countries, Turkey included, but also the United States and conservative Arab monarchies, are not going to revive a form of redistribution that will actually capture 70% of the Syrians who actually have no way out without that kind of state largesse. And if they do, that's good, but they will not, right? There will be money pumped in, but I fear that most Syrians are not going to have, over and above politics, over and above HDS and resistance. What I'm looking at is my own work for the past several decades on political economy of development. This is where I'm thinking most Syrians will end up continuing to suffer in one way or another.
So I know folks were trying to jump in. I want to just, there's one of the reasons this is such a difficult conversation to be had is because there's so many different pieces. And as you have laid out, Bassam, in essays and most recently in a Twitter thread, how you approach this also depends from your ideological point of departure. And I think that both of you in this moment and in the past few days and in the body of your work have tried to embrace this duality, one that marks this moment, one that, explains the relief of an end of a dictatorship and the dread of what's to come precisely because of a regional reconfiguration that the signs of which don't bode well for the rest of the region. And you've given us a lot to think about in terms of, how to think through it. Bassam, when you tell us you can be opposed both to dictatorship and authoritarianism. Omar, when you explain to us that this is not the end of the resistance, but precisely because of the weakness of the resistance that this Syrian regime can collapse at all, or wither, or however else you want to put it. So you all are holding for us a tremendous amount of complexity that I don't think can be resolved and that we didn't attempt to resolve, but attempted to elucidate. I wonder if we have time for just one more question. Since this is called Gaza in Context as a series, and you all have mentioned it, and it might be on our minds that here we have a ceasefire in Lebanon, we have this seismic shift here, and yet 429 days on, the genocide in Gaza continues. And it's not to say that the counterfactual meant that there would have been more support to end the genocide in Gaza. As we've seen, very little has been done, even to recoup the Golan Heights, the sovereignty of which has never been contested. Syrian sovereignty has never been contested, and yet literally taken in broad daylight. And so I wonder, so it's not to say that that was the counterfactual, but precisely because of these regional reconfigurations, are there, Bassam, you mentioned this earlier as well, that this might very well lead to, winding down the genocidal campaign, but it could also mean, an emboldening by Israel. Do you have any signs what this will mean for the future and how we should understand it? And I ask you that knowing that we have very little time. But if you can just give us some bullet points to think through this until next time.
Mouin, you want to start? Or let me say something quickly because I know you have to go. I tried to say as much because I thought you were going to cut me off and then we're going to close. So I tried to squeeze it in. I do think that this is a moment for the apartheid state of Israel to actually keep going. Because nothing is stopping it. All these countries that are watching are not just not doing anything. They're actually even opening doors. But there are interests that have nothing to do with Palestinians and the question of genocide. There are interests within Israel and within its relations with the United States that might lead to this winding down. And there are interests inside Israel as well, which are a little, on the secondary level, but they are there and they are real, that the gains could actually now become or turn into diminishing returns. if things proceed. So there are a number of factors that demonstrate the possibility that after a very intense last month, which is the coming month, there might be a subsiding of genocide. And subsiding of genocide doesn't mean the end of genocide, doesn't mean the end of dispossession and subjugation and annexation and home demolitions and apartheid rule and all sorts of things that we are witnessing in the West Bank, not in Gaza, in the West Bank, where there's no Hamas, when there's no indication that anybody else is ruling except somebody who actually has been complying to the United States and to Israel for the most part, which is the PA. Now, in that sense, yes, I think there is a potential for subsiding, but not before, in my view, Israel basically finalizes some of the last remaining goals that it has, which have to do with structural ethnic cleansing in slow motion, which will make life miserable, so much so that it will actually continue to present the rational option for many in Gaza to actually leave. Because at this point, out of the 2.2 million people, we have more than 500,000 people that are either dead, missing, injured, or that have left Gaza. And then we have probably more who will countenance continuing their life elsewhere until they can return, because the building and rebuilding of Gaza will take a couple of decades to even get started.
Thank you, Bassam. And it's been a very rich discussion. And one of my takeaways is that we will need to have several further rich discussions to begin to get a better understanding of developments in Syria and their background. But I think we're in a much better position today, particularly Omar and Bassam, thanks to your insights. And so on behalf of my co-host, Noura, and myself, would like to thank you very much. And we should do this again soon. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Noura and Mouin,
Thank you, Noura.
and everyone
Yeah,
who's... Allah yafiki.